disease follows on quite, or the presentation about this particular disease, silicosis, follows on quite closely. Unlike lung cancer, silicosis is very associated with tuberculosis, which I think is one of the reasons that Delft have invested in silicosis, because they are similar markets, similar populations. And my perspective, there are two important aspects. One is that I'm an occupational health physician, so I look at it from an occupational health perspective, which is not always quite the same as a public health perspective. And secondly, I come from an area of the world where there are extremely high rates of tuberculosis and HIV, as well as silicosis. Next slide, please. My first presentation really talked about silicosis, the disease due to dust, and I don't want to repeat much of that, but to refer the viewers to the previous presentation, which is still online. And if you get this presentation, you'll be able to go via that URL. Just a few points about the use of CAD for screening or triage. That's what it's used for, not diagnosis. Further investigations, which would increase the sensitivity and the specificity, bronchoscopy, biopsy, are not usually feasible in the settings about which we are talking. Diagnosis is not purely radiological, but it really relies on the acidic exposure history, competing diagnosis. There is no single gold standard test equivalent to GeneXpert. Experienced readers are needed, so it doesn't really mean a lot of radiologists will not have had experience of silicosis, and you really need readers who may not be radiologists that have such experience. For example, in the mining industry, those who have made this area their specialty, and often there's a panel because there's a lot of inter-reader variation. It fails one of the key tests for screening. It is not a treatable disease, and we'll come back to that later. The CAD output, there's no heat map at the moment. It is a numeric output on the 0 to 100 scale. Next slide, please. Oh, so accuracy. So accuracy is a requirement for utility, in other words, for practical applicability that does the things that we heard from the first speaker. It's based on correspondence with the reference standard, which I've just mentioned. It depends on validation and calibration studies. We've done some, and you'll find those online. And it requires at the point, in order to proceed, a choice of threshold. And most people that I've come across when talking about the use of CAD don't really understand the concept of the threshold. Readers use the International Labour Organization classification of pneumoconioses. The CAD is, in a sense, a black box, and silicosis positive depends on where you set your threshold, and often people struggle with that. So they have problems perhaps with interpreting accuracy, but our point of kickoff for this talk is assuming you have an accurate system. What next? Next slide, please. The introduction of CAD for the use cases, and I'll talk about some of them as we go along, a number of them, immediately raises the question of cost. And I just put this there because in making the case for silicosis, often that is the question in your listeners' minds. And there are a number of aspects to the cost. There's the equipment and the software, there's the maintenance, connectivity, and the choice there would be between cloud and local solutions. Delft is heavily invested in local solutions, not requiring the cloud. Data management, that's a capacity issue. Storage, and also the data security is in the modern world increasingly important. Staff time, there's the training of perhaps medical officers or clinical assistants who are turning over. And the health system has to be able to put its own staff into these settings. And then the cost of referral and confirmation by experts alluded to, for example, in following up nodules for lung cancer. In this case, it's not for a sputum, which, for example, could be done on site, but almost certainly referral to experts who are sitting elsewhere. It's a question of what can be transferred to them and what requires the patient or the participants traveling is an important one. So that's the question of cost. We now move on. So adoption, again, people don't quite get it. And I think what I'm finding is that a lot of the attention up to now in the literature has been paid to accuracy and surprisingly little attention to this phase, as it were, of utility and benefits. So efficiency is the one that can certainly be shown. There's a lot of evidence for that. that you are able to lower the costs of the current practice program. For example, fewer referrals for negative chest x-rays if you have an accurate system. And most systems are now fairly accurate, in other words, sensitive with regard to excluding chest x-rays for silicosis. Effectiveness is where there's, again, some misunderstanding, which really asks the question, are the outcomes better than outcomes? We're now talking about medical and survival and morbidity, mortality outcomes better than are currently available. For example, where there's silicosis screening, there is no doctor. In other words, the default would be no screening. There's a misunderstanding, for example, that at last here's a system which can do better than the doctors for silicosis, because it's well known that doctors often miss silicosis, medical practitioners. That is not the case, because that's built in, certainly for expert readers, that's already built in the process of training the CAD based on human readings. So really the use case is the basis for deciding the utility, and there are a number of use cases which I'll talk about, but really the sort of iterative process is the same, that the user, perhaps in collaboration with the Delft, with the vendor, has to decide on the optimal balance of false negatives. That's missed disease. How much does it cost to miss a disease, reputationally, and with regard to medico-legal exposure, and ethically. And false positives, often it's not seen as a greater priority, but in fact they can impose significant costs of referral and investigation for participants who do not have the disease. So just to emphasize the threshold, if people ask what is the threshold for the system? No, these are the potential users. You tell them, no, you have to establish the threshold. They find that quite daunting. Next slide, please, but it's an essential step. Next slide. So the next step that people find surprising, besides having to decide the threshold, that actually the decision depends on something that's well known in clinical epidemiology and predictive science, is the positive predictive value. And that is not this, and its counterpart, the negative predictive value. So sensitivity is of those that are truly positive, how much does the system, the AI system, pick up? This reverses it. Reverses it quite fundamentally. Of all those determined or assigned as positive by the CAD system, what proportion would be confirmed by the gold standard, in this case, the human reader? And it's a law of positive predictive value, that the less common your disease is, and people who've done public health and clinical epidemiology will understand this, the less common the disease, the poorer your positive predictive value. So here are three use cases in my own setting. The first was in employment, screening of minors. They're looking for new cases, so not cases that are known. And in fact, given decline in silicosis and the shrinking of the workforce in South Africa, the proportion of new cases that will be picked up in annual screening is actually very low, 0.3%. Threshold of 39 is imported from a study that we did. In that particular case, with that threshold and that prevalence, the positive predictive value would be 1.6%. The negative predictive value would be 100%. So if the system is able to assigns a chest X-ray as negative silicosis, it's almost 100%. That's very useful. However, if it assigns positive, almost all of those cases going through for confirmation will be found not to have silicosis. That's a substantial cost. And see why it's important for workers as well. I'm going to jump to the last one. I don't have to spend too much on each slide. In the adjudication setting, this is where claims are submitted to the compensation authority. The pre-probability of having silicosis is much higher. They've already been screened. Somebody has identified that there may be silicosis on a chest X-ray. And here we have a prevalence of incoming claims of 25%. Same threshold. The system doesn't change. It's not dependent on the CAD system. It's dependent on the use case context. Here, the positive predictive value reaches 63%. Now, that's much more useful. The negative predictive value is the same. Exclusion means the silicosis is not there. Here, it means that, in fact, in two-thirds, as high as two-thirds of the cases identified by the CAD will, in fact, have silicosis, and that's quite useful. So this is part of the journey that the user has to do. Next slide, please. So we're thinking laterally because we're looking for other applications or other ways in which the CAD can be used. So the focus has always been on one threshold, a binary system. But in fact, because particularly in the compensation system where there's a lot of triage required, thousands of cases come through the system. The backlog 5 years ago was 100,000 claims hadn't been dealt with. CAD is clearly being seen as a way to reduce the load, and the load is actually medico-legally driven. That in our compensation system for minors, you need the director, that's one doctor, 3 other doctors in the panel, and a radiology reading. That's a very heavy staff and expertise load. So you can see that CAD could improve efficiency. And so a lot of the time, because of the interreader variation and the difficulties of distinguishing silicosis and tuberculosis, is spent on the zone I call the zone of uncertainty. And that's actually the middle zone. So this is a 2-threshold model with CAD scores distributed along the x-axis from 0 to 100. There's no, it doesn't come with its own threshold. I have to emphasize that. You have to put in the thresholds. And from the system, the study that I've been drawing on, we choose 2 thresholds. It's based on a choice of NPV and PPV, but let's say 12 for the lower threshold and 78 for the other threshold. So this creates what we call a zone, combined zone of high confidence. If the threshold is below 12 and the CAD identifies a negative silicosis, it's almost certainly negative by confirmation. In fact, there's only one exception. If you look at the shading, that's the little black histogram. For the upper threshold, it's a little smaller. There are fewer positives, but in fact, the CAD using this particular threshold is able to identify correctly most of those positives, and you can see there are only 4 cases with the cross-hatching in the last zone. The middle zone is unclassified. Now the question is, do you want as many referrals, or do you want to bring the thresholds in order to reduce the number of cases going through to the, say, major confirm panel, but at a cost of more false negatives and false positives? So this is really, if you haven't got it to one go, please have another look at the slide. This is the type of calculus that would face the user. So ultimately, it depends on the cost versus utility as seen by that user, in this case, the compensation authority, which is underfunded and has to reduce its use of doctor time. Next slide, please. Previous Bram, if I can call you that, has been through this. This is the well-known principles of screening. It must be manageable or treatable, detected at an earlier stage, and that which the individual present. And in this case, it's used for triage, identify those with more likely to have the disease for priority investigation. That's in addition to screening. The pitfalls are, as we've gone through actually in both presentations, where there's a low prevalence and suboptimal specificity. In other words, specificity is not 100%. You're going to have low positive predictive values such that most referred cases are not going to have the disease. In the occupational setting, there's cost, there's distress, and problematically, there may also be job loss. I'll come back to that. The adverse effects of investigation is not merely the trouble, the time, and the distress, but biopsies have complications, usually infection, but mainly nerve damage, and unnecessary or expensive imaging. People, for example, have to travel to a central hospital or regional hospital where there's a CT scan, if there is one in the country. The benefit to cost ratios for all screenings may be different from the individual, particularly those who have the means to pay for it, and community or institutional perspectives. And often people don't understand, particularly people who are privileged and have medical insurance, that screening for them is not the same as a screening program for a whole community or a country. Next slide, please. So we come back to silicosis and the benefits of screening and triage. Let's start with current workers. That's the one where there aren't that many new cases coming up, but the mining industry is certainly interested. They've been sued, they've had litigation, they're shrinking. I'm talking about gold mining, where the rate of silicosis, the risk is very high. So early detection, what's the point? There's no treatment. However, there is a point. In the occupational health setting, the purpose of early detection of occupational disease is to say that the employer can commit themselves to making the investment and reduce dust. Simple as that. The pitfall is the screening, but no action. And employers struggle with this, and even employees if there are job security issues. And we're talking about the range from multinational mining organizations that have a reputational risk to informal or small-scale miners, of whom it is estimated there are currently about 45 million worldwide, not all exposed to silicosis. If you took it half that, and many of them are working in high TB settings. So talk about the employer investing in dust control can't mean the same thing there if there is an employer. So that is something, certainly a potential. There used to be a medical belief, or maybe a medical legal requirement often, that an employee diagnosed with silicosis has to cease exposure, which usually means ending their job, to avoid progression. Now, there might be some truth in that for certain people, but the basic the reality is that people can't afford to leave work. Often the disease is not highly progressive. The major risk is getting TB. And there's not strong evidence that leaving work, if they've already been exposed to dust and have silica in their lung, averts the TB. Just might come after employment, which actually puts them in a worse position if there's medical care at employment. So pitfall there, unnecessary job loss. Screening workers more regularly, and that makes sense occupationally, but particularly for those who have the genetic predisposition and other factors we don't understand, for regular progression, and particularly to TB. This needs an evidence base, but it's a hypothesis worth testing. Last slide, please. So now we bring together the value of screening for both current and ex-workers. So a big question, and a lot of people, of course, in the TB world are highly committed to, is to treat latent TB infection and the reduce of risk of TB. So certainly it remains a hypothesis, but actually a hypothesis for silica-exposed workers and those with silicosis with regard to effectiveness, not efficacy. Do these programs work? And in fact, the studies that have been done show that in many settings, the effectiveness is not great. And the problem of poor adherence and high adverse effects with certain TPT regimens is actually quite high. Here's something that really is not taken into account in the TB world. So the silicosis and TB worlds are mainly split. Most people, this is a complaint, most people in the TB world do not have an interest in silicosis, only really those in places like Southern Africa, India, perhaps China, Indonesia, others increasingly so. Silicosis may impair, and there's good evidence it does, the response to TB treatment and lung recovery. By lung recovery, I mean the post-TB lung damage and fibrosis. It's now the focus of considerable attention to see if there's anything that can be done about that. And one of the problems for CAD is that the two diseases look alike and they can occur together. So it's a double whammy. The one may be the other, the one may look like the other, but in fact they may both be there. And that is proving to be quite a severe test for CAD accuracy, which is something we're working on. And the last point is something that is probably one of the drivers, certainly in the industry and in Southern Africa, determining eligibility for compensation. This is now later in the disease when you have enough disease for compensation. It's really too late in a way for any, in the preventive sense, and given it's a slow developing disease. Silicosis and silicotuberculosis can occur in any stage once you've had silica. This requires very high sensitivity and panel confirmation that we found for the CAD, and that's something, of course, that we're working on and hopefully be using quite soon in the Southern African context. Thank you very much.